Welcome. Tonight's story is one of the most powerful and uncomfortable truths in American history. This is not a legend, not a movie scene, but the real story of Kunta Kinte, an African man whose identity, resistance, and survival were nearly erased on purpose. His life was buried under altered records, softened retellings, and deliberate silence, but the truth still exists, hidden in ship logs, oral histories, and plantation documents that took years to trace and verify. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because uncovering real historical truth like this requires deep research, cross-checking sources, and separating fact from what history tried to make us forget. Before Kunta Kinte was ever chained, renamed, or forced onto a ship, he was a son of Africa with a full life, a language, a lineage, and a future already mapped out by his people. He was born around 1750 in the village of Jafura, in what is now the Gambia, part of the Mandinka people. This matters because enslavers later tried to strip him of not only his freedom, but his origin, reducing him to property with no past. But Kunta had a past, and it was rich, structured, and deeply rooted. He was raised in a society built on tradition, honor, and oral history, where names carried meaning and ancestry was sacred. From childhood, Kunta was taught who he was, where he came from, and what was expected of him as a Mandinka man. His father, Omoro Kinte, was a respected elder and teacher of the Quran, which meant Kunta grew up in a household of discipline and moral instruction. He learned the customs of his people, the stories of his ancestors, and the spiritual responsibilities that came with manhood. This was not a primitive or chaotic world, as later slave narratives falsely suggested. Jafua was part of a complex West African trade and cultural network, with laws, education, agriculture, and diplomacy. Kunta learned how to farm, hunt, and defend his village. He memorized family histories passed down through generations, because in Mandinka culture, memory was survival. Forgetting who you were meant losing yourself entirely. As Kunta grew older, he entered the Mandinka rite of passage that marked the transition from boyhood to manhood. This initiation was physically demanding and spiritually significant, designed to test endurance, loyalty, and strength. Completing it meant earning respect and responsibility. By the time he returned to his village, Kunta was no longer a child. He was preparing for adulthood, marriage, and leadership. He had plans, expectations, and a future that included raising children who would carry the Kinte name forward. None of this fit the narrative later imposed on him by slave traders who described Africans as nameless, cultureless captives. The moment everything changed came not during war or crime, but during an ordinary task. Kunta was sent into the nearby forest to cut wood for a drum, a sacred object used for communication and ceremony. He never returned. Slave catchers, often working with rival groups or European traders, ambushed him. He was struck, bound, and dragged away before he could call for help. That single moment, a walk into the woods, erased the life he had known. But what the captors didn't understand was that even as they tied his hands, they could not immediately take his identity. Kunta did not forget his name. He did not forget his language. He did not forget Africa. As he was marched toward the coast, Kunta memorized everything: the turns in the path, the position of the sun, the sounds of the land, hoping one day to escape and return. Along the way, he was imprisoned in slave-holding forts where he encountered people from other tribes, all terrified, all confused. many unable to understand one another's languages. Yet Kunta clung to his Mandinka identity as an anchor. He repeated his name silently. He remembered his father's voice. He held on to the belief that this nightmare was temporary. This is the part of Kunta Kinte's story that America tried hardest to bury. Not just the brutality that followed, but the fact that he came from somewhere, that he was not born enslaved, that he was not nameless, that he was not broken when he was captured. Slave systems depended on the lie that Africans had no civilization worth remembering, because acknowledging that truth would expose enslavement as theft, not just of labor, but of lives, cultures, and futures. Even after being forced onto a ship, beaten for speaking his language, and later renamed against his will, Kunta continued to identify himself internally as Kunta Kinte of the Mandinka people. That inner resistance mattered. It is why his story survived at all. Through oral tradition passed down through his descendants, his African identity endured long after official records tried to erase it. His name crossed oceans, generations, and centuries, surviving in whispered memory when written history refused to record it. Keynote 1 is not just about where Kunta came from. It's about what was stolen and what refused to die. Before America knew him as a slave, Kunta Kinte knew himself as a free African man, and that truth is exactly what history tried to bury. The journey that followed Kunta Kinte's capture was designed for one purpose: to erase who he was. From the moment he was forced toward the coast, the slave system began its most brutal work, breaking identity before breaking the body. Kunta was chained with strangers from different regions, men and women who spoke languages he had never heard. This wasn't accidental. Traders knew that separating people by language and culture reduced the chances of rebellion. Confusion became another form of control. Yet even in that confusion, Kunta held on to his name, repeating it silently like a prayer: Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro, Mandinka. When he reached the slave fort on the West African coast, reality turned into something almost impossible to comprehend. The air inside the holding cells was thick with sweat, blood, and despair. People were packed so tightly that sitting or lying down became a negotiation with suffering. Days blurred together. Food was scarce, water worse. Those who resisted were beaten publicly, not just to punish them, but to warn the rest. Kunta watched, memorizing every cruelty, because memory was the only weapon left to him. Then came the ship. The Middle Passage was not a journey. It was a calculated nightmare. Hundreds of captives were forced into the dark belly of the vessel, chained ankle to ankle, laid side by side, with barely enough room to breathe. The smell of vomit, waste, and death clung to everything. Disease spread rapidly. Some captives screamed for days before going silent. Others refused to eat, choosing death over bondage. When they died, their bodies were dragged up and thrown into the sea like broken cargo. Kunta watched the ocean swallow people whole, realizing that the water itself had become a graveyard for stolen lives. The physical suffering was immense, but the psychological assault was even worse. European sailors beat captives for speaking their languages, for praying, for singing, for crying. Anything that reminded them of who they were before was treated as defiance. Kunta learned quickly that survival meant silence. But silence did not mean surrender. Inside his mind, Africa remained alive. He remembered his village, the sound of drums, the voice of his father reciting scripture. These memories became his shield against the madness around him. At some point during the voyage, Kunta realized something terrifying. This ship was not taking him somewhere temporarily. It was removing him permanently. The sun rose and set endlessly, the water never ending. The land he knew was gone. That understanding hit harder than any whip. Still, even then, he refused to accept the lie the captors wanted him to believe, that he was no longer a person. When the ship finally reached America, the survivors were half dead, dragged onto land weak, disoriented, and terrified. Their ordeal was not over, it was only changing shape. They were cleaned, oiled, inspected like animals, their bodies evaluated for strength and usefulness. Kunta did not understand the language spoken around him, but he understood the intent. He was being sold. His life, his labor, his future, all reduced to a price. This is where one of the most violent acts of the entire system took place, the taking of his name. Slave owners renamed captives deliberately, knowing that names tied people to families, histories, and self-worth. When Kunta was renamed Toby, it was not just an insult, it was an attempt at annihilation. He refused it again and again, enduring savage beatings for insisting on his real name. Each time he said, Kunta Kinte, he was declaring that they had not succeeded. Even when his body failed, his identity did not. America tried to bury this part of the story because it exposes the truth of the system. The Middle Passage was not migration. It was mass kidnapping. It was not labor recruitment. It was organized destruction of cultures. Kunta's resistance, his refusal to forget his name, proves that enslaved Africans did not arrive as blank slates. They arrived as people who knew exactly what had been stolen from them. The trauma of that crossing did not end when the ship docked. It lived on in Kunta's silence, his anger, his refusal to accept a false identity. And it lived on through his descendants, who carried fragments of his story long after written records tried to erase it. That journey across the Atlantic was meant to strip Kunta of everything. Instead, it revealed something the system never accounted for. That memory can survive chains, and identity can outlast even the most brutal attempt to destroy it. From the moment Kunta Kinte was forced onto American soil, his life became a daily act of resistance. Not the kind written about in heroic battles or revolts, but the quieter, more dangerous kind. The refusal to surrender his identity. Slaveholders believed that once a man was renamed, beaten, and worked into exhaustion, he would forget who he was. Kunta proved them wrong. His resistance began with a single word, his name. He refused to answer to Toby, the name given to him by his enslaver. Every time he said, Kunta Kinte, he was asserting that he still belonged to himself, to Africa, to a past that slavery could not erase. This defiance came at a terrible cost. Slave systems were built on obedience, and Kunta's refusal was seen as a direct threat. He was beaten repeatedly, whipped until his back split open, locked away, and starved. These punishments were never private. They were public warnings meant to terrify others into submission. Yet even as his body weakened, Kunta's resolve did not. He continued to speak his name, even when each syllable brought pain. To the overseers, this made him dangerous. To those watching in silence, it made him unforgettable. Kunta's resistance extended beyond words. He attempted escape multiple times, driven by the belief that America was temporary and Africa still reachable. Each escape ended in recapture, each return more brutal than the last. On one attempt, he was hunted down with dogs, dragged back in chains, and made an example of. The punishment he received was not only meant to break him physically, but psychologically, to convince him that resistance was useless. But what truly shattered him was the punishment meant to ensure he would never run again. Kunta's foot was cut off. This act was calculated cruelty. Slaveholders understood that removing his ability to escape was more effective than killing him outright. They wanted him alive, but broken. The loss of his foot marked a turning point, not because it ended his resistance, but because it forced it to change shape. Kunta could no longer run, but he did not surrender. His resistance moved inward, into memory, storytelling, and stubborn survival. Even after this injury, Kunta refused to accept the lie that he was content or grateful. He did not romanticize his captivity or soften his memories. He spoke of Africa when he could, telling stories to the children around him, describing the land, the customs, the meaning of his name. Slaveholders feared this kind of resistance almost as much as escape, because stories kept identity alive. Through these whispered lessons, Kunta planted something dangerous: truth. His resistance also took the form of dignity. He worked because he was forced to, but he did not internalize the belief that he was inferior. He judged the world around him through the lens of Mandinka values, quietly rejecting the moral authority of those who enslaved him. This inner refusal mattered. It meant that slavery controlled his body, but not his sense of self. America later tried to soften this part of Kunta Kinte's story. Resistance made enslaved people appear human, conscious, and unwilling, which contradicted the myths used to justify slavery. That's why so many records reduce him to a stubborn slave who eventually learned his place. But oral history tells a different truth. Kunta never accepted that place. He adapted only enough to survive, not to submit. His resistance lived on through his descendants. The stories he told, the name he insisted upon, and the memory of Africa were passed down across generations, even when it was dangerous to do so. That survival of memory is itself an act of rebellion. It proves that the system failed in one of its core objectives: total erasure. Keynote 3 is not just about punishment or suffering. It is about defiance in its most raw form. Kunta Kinte resisted with his body until it was broken, and then with his memory when his body could no longer fight. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Enslaved people did not comply because they agreed with slavery. They survived because resistance took many forms, some visible, some silent, all costly. And that is precisely why America tried so hard to bury this part of his story. What makes Kunta Kinte's story extraordinary is not only what he endured, but how it survived long after the system that tried to erase it had done its worst. Slaveholders controlled written records, renamed people, falsified ages, and destroyed family links on purpose. On paper, Kunta Kinte disappeared. But history does not live only on paper. It lives in memory. And memory was the one place slavery could never fully conquer. Kunta understood this instinctively. When his body could no longer resist, he turned to the most powerful weapon he had left: storytelling. Kunta spoke of Africa whenever he could, especially to children. He told them about Jafure, about the Mandinka people, about the meaning of names, about a world where black people were not owned. These were not bedtime stories meant to comfort. They were acts of preservation. In a system designed to make each generation forget the one before it, Kunta deliberately passed knowledge forward. He made sure his children knew they had ancestors, that their lives did not begin in chains. Even when he was punished for speaking too freely, he continued in fragments, in whispers, in moments when overseers weren't listening. Over time, those fragments became a lineage of memory. Kunta's daughter, Kizzy, carried his stories with her after she was sold away from him, another calculated attempt to break family bonds. Even separated, the knowledge he gave her survived. She passed it to her son, George, known later as Chicken George, who carried the memory forward yet again. Names changed, locations shifted, but the core truth stayed intact. Their ancestor was an African named Kunta Kinte, stolen from his homeland. That knowledge was rare and dangerous. Most enslaved families were denied even that much connection to their past. What's remarkable is how accurate those oral histories remained across generations. While written records reduced people to numbers and property, the spoken word preserved detail, names, places, events, relationships. Long after emancipation, Kunta's descendants continued telling the same story, even when others dismissed it as folklore. It would have been easier to let it fade, to accept the version history handed them. But they didn't. The story mattered because it explained who they were. When Alex Haley, a descendant of Kunta Kinte, began researching his family history in the 20th century, he relied first on those oral traditions. At a time when many historians doubted the reliability of spoken memory, Haley followed the trail anyway. What he found was astonishing: ship records, plantation documents, and Gambian oral historians that aligned with the story passed down through his family. The name Kunta Kinte was not a myth. Jafur was real. The Middle Passage he endured matched historical records. What had survived in whispers was confirmed by archives that slavery never expected anyone to search. This is the part of the story America struggled with most, because it exposes a lie, the idea that enslaved people vanished into history without names, origins, or continuity. Kunta Kinte's story proves that enslaved Africans preserved their identities against overwhelming odds. It also proves that oral history, often dismissed or ignored, can be as powerful as written documentation when institutions are built to suppress truth. The survival of Kunta's story also challenges the idea that slavery ended when chains were removed. The attempt to bury his history continued long after emancipation, through textbooks that erased African origins, through narratives that framed slavery as passive suffering instead of active resistance. Remembering Kunta Kinte disrupts those narratives. It forces acknowledgement that enslaved people remembered, taught, resisted, and passed on truth deliberately. Keynote 4 is about continuity, about how one man's refusal to forget became a multi-generational act of defiance. Kunta Kinte did not live to see freedom, but his story outlived slavery itself. It crossed oceans, centuries, and deliberate erasure. And that survival is no accident. It is proof that history is not only written by the powerful. Sometimes, it survives because ordinary people refuse to let it die. The reason America tried to bury the true story of Kunta Kinte has everything to do with control. Control over narrative, guilt, and identity. Slavery was not only an economic system, it was a psychological one. For it to function, enslaved people had to be stripped of history, dignity, and origin. A man like Kunta Kinte shattered that illusion. He was not born a slave. He had a name, a language, a family, and a homeland. Acknowledging his full story meant admitting that slavery did not create black identity in America. It tried, and failed, to destroy an identity that already existed. That truth was dangerous. For generations, American history was written to justify slavery rather than confront it. Textbooks minimized brutality, reduced Africans to anonymous labor, and framed enslavement as inevitable. Kunta Kinte's story directly contradicts that version of history. It shows a specific African man, with a traceable lineage, violently removed from a known place at a known time. It exposes slavery as theft, not just of labor, but of lives, cultures, and futures. That clarity made people uncomfortable, especially institutions that benefited from silence. There was also fear. If one enslaved person's story could be traced back across the Atlantic, then countless others could too. Kunta Kinte was not an exception, he was evidence. Evidence that millions of African Americans had stolen histories waiting to be uncovered. Recognizing that would require a national reckoning, not just with slavery itself, but with everything built on top of it: wealth, power, and racial hierarchy. It was easier to dismiss his story as folklore than to confront its implications. Even in the modern era, when Alex Haley published Roots, the backlash was immediate. Some critics focused obsessively on minor discrepancies, not because the story was false, but because the truth was too disruptive. No historical account of that scale is perfectly documented, especially when the system in question deliberately destroyed records. Yet the scrutiny applied to Kunta Kinte's story was far harsher than that applied to many accepted historical narratives. That imbalance revealed the real issue: discomfort, not accuracy. What makes this burial attempt especially telling is how long it persisted. Long after slavery ended, Black history was still treated as secondary, optional, or symbolic. Stories like Kunta Kinte's were pushed into cultural categories rather than recognized as central American history. His life was framed as an exception, a dramatic outlier, instead of what it truly was: representative of millions. That framing allowed people to admire the story emotionally while avoiding its lessons politically and socially. And yet, the story refused to stay buried, because it matters in ways that go far beyond the past. Kunta Kinte's story restores something slavery tried to erase: as continuity. It tells African Americans that their history did not begin in chains. And it tells the world that identity can survive even the most violent attempts to destroy it. That matters in a society still shaped by the aftermath of slavery, where questions of belonging, recognition, and justice remain unresolved. It also matters because it redefines resistance. Resistance is often imagined as open rebellion, but Kunta Kinte's life shows another form: the refusal to forget who you are. His insistence on his name, his memory of Africa, and his passing of that knowledge forward was a quiet, relentless challenge to a system that demanded submission. That kind of resistance doesn't end with one lifetime. It compounds across generations. Perhaps most importantly, the story matters because it demands honesty. It forces America to see slavery not as a distant, abstract tragedy, but as a series of individual crimes committed against real people with real lives. When you know Kunta Kinte's name, when you know where he came from, it becomes harder to hide behind vague language or comforting myths. History becomes personal, and personal history is harder to ignore. In the end, America didn't just try to bury Kunta Kinte's story, it underestimated it. Because truth, once spoken and passed on, has a way of resurfacing. His story survived not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. Necessary for descendants seeking identity. necessary for a nation avoiding accountability, and necessary for understanding that the past is not finished with us, especially when we refuse to face it. Long after the chains were removed and the plantations faded into history, the story of Kunta Kinte began doing something slavery never intended. It started changing how the world understood the past. His life stopped being just a personal tragedy and became a reference point, a lens through which millions began re-examining identity, ancestry, and historical truth. For many African Americans, Kunta Kinte's story was the first time they saw an enslaved ancestor presented not as an unnamed victim, but as a complete human being with a life before captivity. That shift was profound because it challenged the silence that generations had been taught to accept. Before this story reached the wider world, most black families were told that tracing lineage beyond slavery was impossible. Records were missing, names were changed, and Africa was treated like a blank space. Kunta Kinte's story shattered that belief. It proved that history could be reclaimed, even when systems worked tirelessly to erase it. Suddenly, genealogy was no longer just a hobby for the privileged. It became an act of recovery and resistance. People began searching ship manifests, plantation ledgers, oral histories, and burial records with renewed purpose, inspired by the idea that their own Kunta Kinte might be waiting to be rediscovered. Globally, the impact reached even further. In Africa, particularly in the Gambia, Kunta Kinte's name reignited conversations about the transatlantic slave trade that colonial narratives had long minimized. African historians and elders saw international audiences finally listening to stories they had preserved orally for centuries. The connection between Africa and its diaspora, long strained by distance and trauma, felt tangible again. For many, Kunta Kinte became a symbol of reunion. Painful, incomplete, but real. The story also forced mainstream America to confront something it had avoided. Slavery was not ancient history. Its consequences were living, breathing, and visible in the present. Kunta Kinte's descendants existed. His pain echoed forward. That realization made it harder to treat slavery as a closed chapter. Debates around race, inequality, and historical responsibility suddenly had a face and a name attached to them, and that made denial far more difficult. At the same time, the legacy was not without resistance. Some attempted to dilute the story's power by turning it into entertainment rather than education. Others tried to separate emotional impact from historical responsibility, praising the narrative while rejecting its implications. But even these reactions proved the same point. The story mattered enough to provoke discomfort. Silence would have been easier. The fact that people argued, resisted, and debated showed how deeply it cut. Perhaps the most enduring impact of Kunta Kinte's legacy is how it reframed strength. Strength was no longer just survival under brutality, but the preservation of self. Refusing to forget a name, refusing to let identity dissolve, refusing to accept the version of history handed down by oppressors. That idea continues to resonate today, especially in communities still fighting to have their stories told accurately and completely. In modern classrooms, documentaries, and conversations, Kunta Kinte represents more than the past. He represents unfinished work. His story reminds us that history is not neutral, and that what gets remembered is often chosen deliberately. Remembering him is not about nostalgia or guilt. It's about truth. Truth that empowers people to understand where they come from and why the present looks the way it does. Keynote 6: at its core, is about endurance beyond the individual. Kunta Kinte did not live to see freedom, recognition, or justice, but his story did. It crossed centuries, oceans, and systems designed to erase it. And as long as people continue to seek truth instead of comfort, his legacy remains alive, not as a relic of the past, but as a challenge to the present.